Following the catastrophic, irreversible defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, the entire strategic balance of the Eastern Front decisively shifted. The German army had been comprehensively beaten, its operational mobility severely curtailed, and its strategic initiative permanently lost. The German High Command now faced the grim reality of waging a protracted, defensive war of attrition against the immense, mobilizing resources of the Soviet Union. However, Adolf Hitler, driven by unyielding defiance and a profound inability to accept strategic retreat, believed that one final, massive offensive blow could restore the strategic initiative and prove that the disaster at Stalingrad was merely a localized setback. This desperate, colossal gamble became known as Operation Citadel. The immediate focus of the German planning centered on a unique and geographically immense bulge in the Soviet front line known as the Kursk salient, or Kursk bulge. This enormous protrusion extended roughly 150 miles to 140 kilometers into the German lines and presented a strategically tempting, yet equally dangerous, target. For the German High Command, the salient represented both a massive threat and a singular opportunity. The threat lay in the fact that the salient offered the Soviet army ideal jumping-off points for a massive summer offensive that could potentially collapse the entire German southern front. The opportunity, however, was irresistible to the German strategic mindset. If the German army could launch a massive, coordinated pincer attack, severing the base of the salient and encircling the immense concentration of Soviet forces trapped within, they could potentially inflict a catastrophic defeat on the Red Army, forcing Stalin to sue for peace or at least dramatically delaying any Soviet offensive action. Operation Citadel was conceived as a classic double envelopment, a repeat of the successful cauldron tactics used in 1941, but executed on an even grander, more concentrated scale. The strategic objectives for the German army were clear, but dangerously ambitious. Firstly, the immediate military objective was the elimination of the Soviet forces within the salient. This would shorten the German front line considerably, freeing up vital divisions for deployment elsewhere. Secondly, the political objective was to regain the strategic initiative. A decisive victory at Kursk, the German High Command desperately hoped, would force the Allied powers to reconsider their planned invasions of Europe and might even convince the Soviet Union to agree to a favorable peace settlement, allowing Hitler to stabilize the Eastern Front. Thirdly, and perhaps most desperately, the battle was intended to be the grand showcase for Germany's new generation of armored warfare. The German forces planned to debut massive numbers of their formidable, new heavy tanks, the Tiger and the Panther, alongside improved self-propelled guns. The deployment of these technically superior weapons was intended to achieve a technological and tactical superiority that would smash through the Soviet lines and confirm the continued dominance of the German army on the battlefield. However, the planning for Operation Citadel was plagued by internal disagreement, delay, and, crucially, a fatal loss of the element of surprise. Many senior German field marshals, particularly Heinz Guderian, the inspector of armored forces, vehemently opposed the offensive. Guderian correctly argued that the Soviets were fully aware of the salient's vulnerability and were already heavily fortifying the area. He warned that the offensive would squander the final armored reserves necessary for the defense of the entire Eastern Front, effectively milking the cow until it died. Despite these crucial objections, Hitler postponed the operation several times, driven by the desire to incorporate even more of the new Tiger and Panther tanks into the attacking force. These fatal delays, from the original planned date in May to the final launch in early July, provided the Soviet forces with invaluable, unprecedented time to prepare their immense defenses. The Battle of Kursk would not be a surprise attack. It would be a frontal assault against the most heavily fortified position ever constructed on the Eastern Front. The concentration of forces on both sides was unparalleled in military history, making Kursk the largest single tank engagement ever fought. The German commitment of nearly 900,000 men and over 2,700 tanks faced an opposing Soviet force of over 1.3 million men and more than 3,600 tanks, supported by layer upon layer of deep, interconnected defensive lines. The stakes were absolute. For Germany, it was the final, desperate attempt to reclaim its lost initiative. For the Soviet Union, it was the chance to definitively secure the strategic victory won at Stalingrad and condemn the German war machine to a long, grinding retreat. The entire strategic basis of the German offensive, Operation Citadel, rested upon achieving a lightning-fast, decisive breakthrough that would encircle the vast Soviet forces trapped within the Kursk salient. However, the Soviets, unlike the previous years, held a fatal advantage that the German command had squandered: time. The constant postponements of the German attack, driven by Hitler's desire to incorporate more of the new heavy Tiger and Panther tanks into the attacking force, provided the Soviet High Command with an unprecedented, invaluable opportunity to prepare the battlefield for a protracted, defensive war. The result was the creation of the most massive, most complex, and deepest layered defense system ever constructed on the Eastern Front. The Soviet defensive strategy, orchestrated by generals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, was built upon a profound understanding of the German lightning war doctrine. They knew the enemy would prioritize speed and armored thrusts to create deep penetration. The Soviet response was designed not merely to resist the attack, but to systematically absorb, contain, and ultimately grind down the German armored forces until they were exhausted, allowing the Red Army to transition seamlessly into a massive counteroffensive. The core of this plan involved establishing an immense, six-layered defensive system stretching back roughly 150 to 180 miles to 140 to 290 kilometers from the front line. The depth and complexity of this defense were staggering. It was divided into three main operational zones, each comprising 2 or 3 distinct belts of fortifications. The primary goal of the initial defense layers was to shatter the momentum and mobility of the German armored spearheads, preventing them from achieving the high speed necessary for successful encirclement. This initial zone was a dense labyrinth of anti-tank weaponry, minefields, and fortified infantry positions. The density of the minefields was unprecedented. Some estimates suggest that over 1 million anti-tank and anti-personnel mines were laid within the salient, creating massive mine barriers stretching for miles. These minefields were strategically integrated with carefully positioned anti-tank ditches, large earthen embankments, and rows of anti-tank obstacles, all designed to funnel the German tanks into predetermined killing zones. Behind these initial obstacles lay the first defensive belt, held by concentrated Soviet infantry and fortified machine gun and artillery emplacements. The defense was designed to be highly resilient, forcing the German infantry and engineers to expend valuable time and massive amounts of ammunition clearing the obstacles and engaging entrenched positions. The subsequent belts of defense were layered with massive concentrations of anti-tank artillery, including thousands of the highly effective 76.2mm ZIS-3 field guns, specifically tasked with engaging the formidable new German heavy tanks. Every defensive position was meticulously prepared to withstand heavy bombardment, with vast networks of trenches and underground bunkers providing cover for the Soviet troops. A crucial and revolutionary aspect of the Soviet strategy was the deliberate positioning of their largest and most powerful forces behind the active defensive lines. The steppe front, comprising immense tank and infantry reserves, was held hundreds of miles in the rear, deliberately kept out of the initial engagement. This reserve group served two critical purposes. First, to act as a definitive, unbreachable strategic reserve, guaranteeing that even if the first 5 layers of defense were breached, the Germans would not be able to achieve a clean strategic breakthrough. And second, to act as the massive, decisive striking force for the eventual, planned Soviet counteroffensive, ensuring that when the Soviet army finally struck, they would do so against an enemy that was utterly exhausted, low on fuel, and numerically depleted by the defensive attrition. by delaying the offensive. Hitler gifted the Soviets approximately 3 crucial months to perfect this massive defense. The immense effort required the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of civilians, primarily women and elderly men, who tirelessly dug the thousands of miles of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and bunkers that characterized the massive defensive system. This labor commitment ensured that, when Operation Citadel finally launched in early July, the German forces were not facing a surprised enemy, but a vast, prepared, and unbreakable wall of defense, perfectly designed to negate the tactical advantage of their new generation of armored forces. The Germans had provided the Soviets with the absolute knowledge of their intent, and the Soviets had spent that time building their enemy a military graveyard. The Battle of Kursk was fundamentally destined to be the largest, most decisive armored engagement ever fought in the history of warfare, a clash where the sheer scale of the tank forces committed by both sides surpassed anything the world had witnessed before or since. The confrontation pitted the German drive for technological superiority against the Soviet commitment to overwhelming mass production and robust, simple design. The strategic importance of the battle was deeply intertwined with the performance and deployment of these colossal armored forces. For the German army, Operation Citadel was explicitly designed to be the proving ground for its new generation of heavy tanks, vehicles intended to definitively restore the tactical edge that the German forces had lost since encountering the formidable Soviet T-34 tank in 1941. The centerpiece of this armored offensive was the debut of the Tiger I heavy tank. The Tiger was a true armored behemoth, boasting armor plating that was impervious to virtually all Soviet anti-tank guns at standard ranges, and equipped with a devastating 88mm main gun that could penetrate any Soviet tank with ease from immense distances. Its presence on the battlefield carried an enormous psychological impact, terrifying Soviet crews who knew their shells often simply bounced off the Tiger's front glacis plate. Joining the Tiger was the Panther medium tank, developed as a direct, strategic answer to the Soviet T-34. The Panther incorporated several revolutionary features, including sloped armor, which significantly increased its effective thickness against incoming shells, and a high-velocity 75mm gun that offered superior range and penetration power compared to any existing Allied medium tank. The German High Command, relying heavily on the promise of these new, technologically advanced fighting machines, delayed the offensive several times to ensure that hundreds of these tanks could be integrated into the attacking forces. This reliance on the quality and power of the new heavy tanks was the core of the German tactical plan. The Tigers and Panthers were to spearhead the attack, breaking through the Soviet defenses while absorbing the immense damage, allowing the lighter forces to exploit the gaps. Facing this technological wave was the sheer, organized, and overwhelming power of the Soviet armored forces. The Soviet commitment to the Battle of Kursk was unparalleled, fielding over 3,600 tanks and self-propelled guns within the salient and its immediate reserves. The backbone of this immense force was the legendary T-34 medium tank. While the T-34 was numerically inferior to the new German heavy tanks in terms of armor protection and main gun range, its strengths lay in its rugged reliability, ease of mass production, and operational simplicity. The T-34's wide tracks made it excellent for maneuvering across the difficult terrain, and its sloped armor still offered good protection against older German guns. Crucially, the Soviet strategy was not based on technological quality in individual tank duels, but on overwhelming quantity and operational depth. For every German Tiger, the Soviets could field 3 or 4 T-34s. Furthermore, the Soviets deployed massive numbers of specialized anti-tank vehicles, including the powerful Su-15 self-propelled gun, nicknamed the Animal Killer for its ability to destroy the new German heavy tanks with its immense high-explosive shells, often achieved by literally ripping off the tank turret through concussive force. The Soviet strategy was designed to fight the battle not tank for tank, but system for system, integrating their tanks into massive defensive formations, supported by layered anti-tank artillery anti-tank rifles, and the immense minefields that stretched across the entire defensive zone. The Battle of Kursk was thus set up as the ultimate test of two contrasting military philosophies. On the German side, the belief that superior technology and individual armored might could prevail against overwhelming numbers. On the Soviet side, the conviction that mass production, deep defense, and continuous reinforcement would ultimately grind down any technological advantage the enemy possessed. The immense scale of the tank deployment, coupled with the critical importance of the battle, ensured that Kursk would be the moment where the strategic dominance of one style of warfare and one side would be permanently asserted on the Eastern Front. The initial hours of the battle would decide whether the immense power of the new German tanks could penetrate the unbreakable wall of Soviet steel and earth. The single most critical failure that doomed Operation Citadel long before the first German tank rolled out of its assembly area was the disastrous loss of strategic surprise. The German High Command, particularly Adolf Hitler, became tragically convinced that the sheer technological superiority of their new Tiger and Panther tanks was sufficient to guarantee victory, leading to agonizing and ultimately fatal delays in the launch of the offensive. This hesitation provided the Soviet Union with an invaluable, unprecedented window of time that they exploited with surgical precision, transforming the intended ambush into a frontal assault against an unbreakable wall of prepared defense. The initial date for the offensive was planned for mid-May 1943, a time when the ground would have been dry enough for mechanized movement, and the Soviet preparations were still incomplete. However, Hitler postponed the operation multiple times, first to mid-June, and finally to July 5, 1943, driven by the singular, almost obsessive desire to integrate every last possible Panther tank into the attacking force. Hitler believed that these new heavy tanks were the non-negotiable key to victory, ignoring the fact that time was the ultimate strategic currency. Field marshals like Heinz Guderian vehemently argued against the delay, warning the German leader, "The entire battle is already known to the Russians. Why launch it at all?" Guderian's crucial advice was dismissed, and his fears were completely justified. The Soviet army possessed an immense advantage derived from its highly successful intelligence network through agents operating deep within German commands such as the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, and the meticulous work of Soviet intelligence gathering, including capturing and interrogating German officers and examining plans. The Soviet High Command obtained near-perfect knowledge of the German intentions. By April 1943, Moscow knew the operation's code-named Citadel, the primary objectives to pinch off the salient, the general attack corridors, the northern and southern faces, and, most critically, the approximate date of the offensive. This intelligence windfall eliminated any possibility of a surprise attack and directly informed the Soviet defensive strategy. The months gained by Hitler's hesitation, nearly 3 crucial months of good weather, were immediately and effectively utilized by the Soviet defense. The Soviet forces launched a massive, nationwide mobilization to fortify the salient. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, auxiliary personnel, and front-line troops worked tirelessly, creating the defensive complex that was detailed earlier, a massive system of interconnected trenches, tank traps, and minefields that stretched back over 150 miles. This immense construction effort ensured that, when the German heavy tanks finally struck in July, they were not charging into open Soviet territory, but crashing headlong into an already prepared, multi-layered defensive system designed specifically to absorb, contain, and methodically destroy the German armored strength through attrition. Furthermore, the delay allowed the Soviet High Command to perfect their logistical and resource buildup. The Soviet tank factories, producing the robust T-34 at an unprecedented rate, were able to completely replenish their losses and build up the massive armored reserves necessary for the eventual counteroffensive. While Hitler waited for his Panthers, the Soviet forces were able to amass a crushing numerical superiority in tanks and artillery within the salient and, crucially, hold their formidable step-front reserve armies far in the rear, ready to deliver the decisive counter-blow against the exhausted German forces. The German miscalculation was simple. they prioritized the quantity of their new equipment over the element of surprise, effectively turning their technological advantage into a costly tactical trap. The immense, long-anticipated clash finally began on the early morning of July 5, 1943, marking the launch of Operation Citadel, the final major strategic offensive of the entire German army on the Eastern Front. The attack, initially planned for 4:30 a.m., was met with a sudden, unexpected, and devastating obstacle even before the German armored formations began their movement. Thanks to the comprehensive intelligence network that provided the Soviet command with near-perfect knowledge of the German plans, the Soviet forces were able to launch a massive preemptive counter-artillery strike minutes before the German planned offensive. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces and mortar tubes opened a crushing barrage on the German staging areas, which were densely packed with tanks and troops preparing for the attack. While this initial counter-bombardment did not completely halt the offensive, it caused significant chaos, inflicted substantial casualties among the forward German units, delayed the tanks' crucial deployment, and undermined morale, forcing German commanders to launch their offensive under immediate disorganization and pressure. As the two German Panzer Armies Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and Army Group Center under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge finally lurched forward, they immediately encountered the first, most terrifying barrier, the endless, unprecedentedly dense minefields. The Soviet defensive doctrine was explicitly designed to neutralize the German advantage of mobility, and these mine barriers formed the first, deepest echelon of defense. In some critical sectors of the front, there were estimates of up to 2,500 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines per square kilometer. These massive minefields were not merely passive obstacles. They were strategically integrated into the overall fire system, acting as a massive attrition zone designed to channel the attacking forces. For the German crews of the new Tiger and Panther tanks, which were designed and built specifically for rapid breakthrough, the encounter with these deep minefields was a profound shock. Tanks hitting the mines were instantly immobilized, losing their tracks and transforming into static, helpless targets for the Soviet artillery and anti-tank rifles positioned along the flanks. The critical speed of the German attack, the very essence of the lightning war tactic, plummeted to minimal levels. German engineers and infantry were forced to work under continuous artillery and machine gun fire to manually clear narrow paths, which caused immense, unrecoverable losses among the engineer companies and created an operational bottleneck through which the entire armored, striking force was forced to pass slowly and dangerously on the southern face of the Kursk salient, where the most powerful formation under Manstein was attacking. The German armored divisions, including the elite SS formations, were forced to fight their way through this immense minefield attrition. Instead of the anticipated lightning advance, the penetration was agonizingly slow, measured in yards rather than miles. The attack, which was meant to be a swift, surgical strike, immediately devolved into a slow, debilitating frontal assault against prepared fortifications, where the German tank's advantage in armor thickness was rendered irrelevant by the density of the mines and the sheer volume of concentrated, pre-registered Soviet fire. The Soviet troops, well protected in their deep, interconnected trenches, observed as German engineers and infantry perished slowly attempting to clear the path for the bogged-down tanks. Operation Citadel began as a frontal, bloody assault that, from its very first hour, shattered Hitler's core strategic idea to achieve victory through technological quality and speed before the Soviet defenses could become fully engaged and operational. The final strategic initiative of the German army was being bled out, mine by mine, in the fields of Kursk, while the southern face of the Kursk salient witnessed grinding, agonizing breakthroughs by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's powerful armored formations. The northern face, entrusted to the German Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, met with a rapid and decisive failure that shattered the German High Command's overall strategic timetable. The entire concept of Operation Citadel hinged upon the simultaneous, rapid success of both the northern and southern pincers. The swift collapse of the northern attack confirmed the catastrophic loss of the element of surprise and the overwhelming effectiveness of the Soviet defenses. Kluge's forces, though formidable, faced terrain that was significantly less favorable for large-scale armored maneuver compared to the south. The area north of Kursk was characterized by dense forests, numerous small rivers, and deep ravines, features that naturally inhibited the speed and wide flanking movements essential to the German lightning war doctrine. Furthermore, the Soviet defenses in the north, manned by General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front, were arguably even more robustly prepared than those in the south, comprising an immense, interconnected web of anti-tank obstacles, heavily fortified strong points, and minefields of staggering density. The Soviet command had deliberately focused on ensuring the northern flank could not yield, knowing its success would guarantee a decisive victory. The German Northern Pincer, launched on July 5, 1943, immediately crashed into this immense, pre-prepared wall of Soviet defense. The German armored divisions, spearheaded by the new heavy tanks, found their progress reduced to a frustrating crawl from the very first hour. Unlike the south, where Manstein's forces managed to achieve initial penetrations of several miles, Kluge's forces struggled desperately to breach even the first major defensive belt. The vast Soviet minefields, which were precisely positioned using the invaluable advance intelligence gathered by Soviet agents, proved devastatingly effective. German tanks, including the new heavy armor, were disabled at an alarming rate, turning the battlefield into a graveyard of immobilized steel that became an easy target for Soviet artillery and concentrated anti-tank fire. The meticulously planned German timetable, which had predicted a rapid breakthrough within 48 hours, was shattered on the first day. The fighting quickly became a brutal, grinding battle of attrition, a siege warfare entirely unsuited to the German strategic goals. The Soviet defense was elastic and lethal, absorbing the continuous German attacks while methodically inflicting immense casualties. The Soviet Tactical Command ensured that the German forces were continuously channeled into predetermined killing zones, where massive concentrations of anti-tank artillery, often firing over open sights, could engage the heavy tanks at close range, exploiting their specific weaknesses and destroying their supporting infantry. The German forces could not generate the necessary speed to bypass these positions, forcing their entire operational plan into a costly, debilitating frontal assault. Recognizing the tactical failure of the northern thrust and the immense expenditure of men and materiel for minimal territorial gain, the Soviet High Command immediately seized the initiative. While the northern German forces were still actively engaged in the costly attempt to breach the first defensive layer, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive to the north of the salient. Operation Kutuzov, launched on July 12, 1943. This operation struck the German forces in the Ural salient, north of the main Kursk battleground, hitting the exposed flanks and rear of Kluge's Army Group Center. This action was designed to create an immediate, intolerable threat to the German forces fighting at Kursk. The immense power and speed of the Soviet counterattack forced the German High Command to divert crucial armored reserves away from the Kursk offensive to stabilize the collapsing Ural sector. This critical diversion ensured that the German attack on the northern face of the Kursk salient had to be halted definitively. The simultaneous failure of the frontal assault and the successful launching of the Soviet counteroffensive in the Ural region confirmed that Hitler's last roll of the dice in the north had failed utterly. With the German northern pincer definitively halted and strategically defeated by the sheer depth of the Soviet defenses and the launch of the Ural counteroffensive, the entire focus of the Battle of Kursk shifted decisively to the southern face of the salient. Here, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's powerful Army Group South had managed to achieve a deep, agonizing penetration, successfully fighting through multiple layers of the Soviet defensive system. The German forces, spearheaded by the elite armored divisions of the SS Panzer Corps, had advanced nearly 40 miles, 65 kilometers, pushing the Soviet defense to its absolute operational limit. Manstein's goal was simple: to achieve one final, crushing breakthrough that would allow his mobile forces to bypass the main Soviet lines and turn the tactical victory into a strategic encirclement. The Soviet High Command, recognizing the extreme danger posed by Manstein's continued, relentless drive, which was threatening to rupture their entire southern front, made a monumental decision. Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky committed the formidable Steppe Front Reserve, commanded by General Ivan Konev, and the massive 5th Guards Tank Army directly into the path of the German advance. The immense armored confrontation that followed was centered on the small railway village of Prokhorovka, and it would become the largest concentrated tank battle ever recorded in military history. The clash occurred on July 12, 1943. The battle was characterized by the sheer, staggering concentration of armored power engaged in a relatively small area. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, consisting primarily of the rugged T-30 for medium tanks and massive numbers of supporting self-propelled guns, launched a massive, full-scale counterattack directly against the spearhead of the German advance, which was centered on the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. At its peak, the engagement saw approximately 850 Soviet tanks clash head-on with roughly 450 German tanks and heavy assault guns, including a significant number of the powerful new Tiger I heavy tanks and Panther medium tanks. The scale of this armored commitment reflected the absolute existential stakes. For the Germans, it was the final door to victory. For the Soviets, it was the last line of defense before the front collapsed. The Soviet strategy was daring, bordering on reckless, but strategically sound, recognizing the undeniable technological superiority of the German heavy tanks whose long-range guns could destroy the Soviet T-34s before they could even get within firing range. The Soviet commanders ordered their tanks to charge forward with maximum speed, aiming to engage the German armor at close quarters, effectively reducing the engagement distance to less than 500 yards. This tactic was designed to negate the German tanks' superior gun range and thick, sloped armor. In the ensuing close-quarters melee, the battle became chaotic and visually spectacular. Tanks from both sides were locked in close-range fighting, where the agility of the T-34 could be used to flank the slower, heavier German Tigers, and the sheer momentum of the Soviet mass could overwhelm the German defenses. Visibility was severely limited by dust, smoke, and explosions, turning the massive field into a turbulent, deafening armored brawl. The material losses on both sides during the Battle of Prokhorovka were immense. The Soviets suffered catastrophic casualties, losing hundreds of tanks destroyed or severely damaged, far more than the German losses. However, the true strategic result of the battle was a decisive operational failure for the German forces. The intense Soviet counterattack, despite its immense cost, successfully halted the final German drive. Manstein's formations, though tactically successful in certain localized skirmishes, were unable to break through to the open ground beyond the defensive lines. The German armored reserves were used up, their combat fatigue was immense, and the final momentum required for the strategic breakthrough was irreversibly lost. The Battle of Prokhorovka marked the climax of Operation Citadel and the definitive moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed entirely and permanently to the Soviet Union. Following the massive, inconclusive armored engagement at Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, the situation on the Eastern Front, while still intensely volatile, had reached a tactical stalemate. Manstein's southern forces, though unable to achieve the decisive breakthrough required for encirclement, had inflicted severe casualties on the Soviet tank reserves. Conversely, the German armored reserves were utterly exhausted, and the core strategic mission to cut off the salient remained unfulfilled. The immense attrition suffered by both sides meant the German war machine, built for swift victory, was now dangerously depleted, possessing no strategic reserves to continue the offensive. However, the definitive end of Operation Citadel was not decided on the scorching plains of Kursk, but by a sudden, critical strategic development thousands of miles away in the Mediterranean. On July 10, 1943, just 2 days before the climactic battle at Prokhorovka, the Western Allies launched a massive, Successful amphibious invasion of Sicily Operation Husky. This Allied landing immediately opened a new, highly dangerous front against the Axis powers in southern Europe and posed an intolerable threat to the German position in Italy and the Balkans. The Italian leadership, already demoralized and teetering on the brink of political collapse, was immediately put under immense pressure, and Hitler recognized the acute danger of his most vital European ally being knocked out of the war. The news of the successful Allied landings forced an immediate, decisive intervention from Hitler, overruling the wishes of his field commanders. Recognizing that he could not afford to lose Italy and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, Hitler convened an emergency conference at his headquarters. Ignoring the immense commitment and sacrifice already made at Kursk, and the desperate pleas of his generals like Field Marshal von Manstein to allow the battle to continue its course, Hitler issued the fatal order on July 13, 1943. Operation Citadel was to be halted immediately and definitively. The German armored formations, the powerful SS Panzer Corps, and the new heavy tank units were to be instantly disengaged and diverted south and west to meet the Allied threat in Italy and the Balkans. This was a profound, strategic admission of failure by the German political leadership. The halt order came, just as the German army was achieving its deepest penetration in the south, sacrificing the entire, colossal effort and the immense losses suffered over the previous 10 days. The withdrawal was carried out immediately and efficiently, allowing the German forces to save the bulk of their fighting corps, but it handed the strategic initiative completely and permanently to the Soviet Union. The German army had failed to break the Soviet defenses. In the precious, final armored reserves, the Tiger and Panther tanks were now committed to fighting defensive battles in a new, peripheral theater of war. The ultimate consequence of this political decision was irreversible. By halting Citadel, Hitler conceded the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front forever. The German army would never again possess the mobile strength, the industrial backing, or the strategic concentration of force required to launch a major, massive-scale offensive capable of securing a decisive victory. From this point forward, the German war machine was irrevocably committed to a protracted, devastating defensive war of attrition on the Eastern Front, fighting continuously to hold ground under the relentless pressure of the now numerically and strategically dominant Red Army. The immense sacrifice at Kursk proved that the German military could be stopped and broken by superior planning and overwhelming force, marking the definitive moment when the final collapse of the German position in the East became an inevitability. The definitive halt of Operation Citadel on July 13, 1943, represented an immense strategic victory for the Soviet Union, yet the battle was far from over. Recognizing that the German forces were exhausted, demoralized, and actively preparing to withdraw their valuable Panther and Tiger tank reserves to face the Allied threat in Sicily, the Soviet High Command moved with aggressive speed to seize the strategic initiative they had so dearly won. The goal was no longer merely to defend the Kursk salient, but to launch a massive counteroffensive that would decisively break the German front lines, drive the enemy out of the entire region, and fully commit the German army to a protracted, devastating retreat. The Soviet counteroffensive was launched into coordinated phases, focusing first on the northern sector where the German attack had been decisively repulsed. On July 12, 1943, the same day as the climactic tank battle at Prokhorovka, the Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov. This operation was aimed at the German Ninth Army, which had been fighting on the northern face of the salient, striking deeply into the German-held Orel salient, located immediately north of the main Kursk battlefield. The massive Soviet counterattack, utilizing overwhelming numbers of infantry and tanks, struck the German forces' exposed flanks and began a rapid advance that threatened to engulf the entire German Ninth Army. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's forces were immediately forced onto a desperate, continuous defensive, diverting crucial resources needed elsewhere. By August 18th, the Germans were completely expelled from the Orel salient, and the Soviet success confirmed that the entire northern German front was now irrevocably committed to retreat. Concurrently, the focus shifted back to the southern face, where Manstein's elite armored divisions were attempting a phased tactical withdrawal to conserve their heavy tanks. The Soviet offensive in the south was launched in early August, codenamed Operation Polkovodets Rumyantsov, Operation Commander Rumyantsov. This massive strike was aimed at the German Army Group South, seeking to drive deep toward the crucial Ukrainian cities of Belgorod and Kharkiv. The fighting was intense and often highly mobile, as the Soviets, now benefiting from air supremacy and superior numbers, used their tank armies to punch through the depleted German lines. The Germans, deploying their Tiger and Panther reserves in costly counterattacks, fought tenaciously to hold open corridors for their retreating forces, but the continuous, relentless pressure of the Soviet attack proved too overwhelming. The Soviet victory in the south achieved several critical objectives. The key city of Belgorod was liberated on August 5, and just weeks later, the massively important industrial and railway hub of Kharkiv was recaptured after a prolonged and brutal fight. The successful seizure of Kharkiv marked the definitive, operational conclusion of the Battle of Kursk. The German army had not only failed to capture the salient, they had been aggressively pushed back to the positions they held before the start of the offensive and, in many areas, forced to retreat even further west. The entire German front line in the south was forced into a massive, strategic withdrawal back toward the defensive barrier of the Dnieper River, abandoning vast tracts of valuable Ukrainian territory. The significance of these counteroffensives was absolute. The Soviet Union had not only successfully defended its most vital salient against the best final armored formations the German army could muster, but it had immediately followed that defense with a coordinated, massive offensive that inflicted immense, irreplaceable losses on the German army's personnel and heavy equipment. The victories achieved in the summer of 1943 permanently secured the strategic initiative for the Soviet Union. The German army was permanently denied the ability to launch any further massive, strategic-level offensives on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the long, brutal march of the German army would be almost exclusively a continuous, devastating retreat, with the Soviet forces relentlessly dictating the terms and the tempo of the war. Kursk definitively confirmed the inevitability of the German defeat. The conclusion of the Battle of Kursk in August 1943, following the decisive Soviet counteroffensives, represented not merely the end of a major engagement, but the definitive strategic rupture of the German war machine. The failure of Operation Citadel and the immense, irreplaceable losses suffered by the German army confirmed what the defeat at Stalingrad had strongly suggested. The era of German offensive power on the Eastern Front was irrevocably over. This event was, without question, the final, crucial turning point of the Second World War, condemning Germany to a desperate, continuous retreat that would consume the vast majority of its remaining military resources. The most immediate and profound consequence was the total loss of strategic initiative for the German military. Prior to Kursk, the German High Command still possessed the ability to choose when and where the next major battle would occur, even if their resources were stretched. After Kursk, this initiative passed entirely and permanently to the Soviet Union. The Red Army, now possessing overwhelming numerical superiority in tanks, aircraft, and manpower, was free to dictate the tempo and direction of the war, launching continuous, massive offensives that forced the German army into a protracted, exhausting defensive struggle. This permanent shift fundamentally changed the nature of the fighting, as Germany could only react to Soviet movements, desperately fighting to hold ground rather than to win territory. The material losses suffered by Germany at Kursk were immense and impossible to recover from. While the Soviet Union suffered higher casualties in men and tanks during the initial defense, their superior industrial production capacity, backed by resources channeled through the American Lend-Lease program, allowed them to replenish their losses quickly and easily. Conversely, the destruction of Germany's final strategic reserve of elite Panther and Tiger tanks, along with thousands of experienced airmen and infantry officers, represented a permanent void in German military power. The specialized armored divisions that spearheaded Citadel were shattered, and these highly trained units could never be rebuilt to their former strength. This irreparable material damage ensured that the German army lacked the necessary mobile reserves to successfully defend against the inevitable Soviet offensives that would follow. The victory at Kursk had immediate and beneficial ramifications for the Western Allies. By tying down and grinding down the bulk of the German army in the immense battles on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union effectively guaranteed the success of the Anglo-American efforts in the West. The German decision to halt Citadel and divert forces to deal with the Allied invasion of Sicily, an event that occurred concurrently, demonstrated that Germany was already forced into a desperate two-front struggle that stretched its resources beyond the breaking point. The victory at Kursk ensured that, when the Western Allies eventually launched the Normandy invasion Operation Overlord, the German forces facing them would be severely diminished, lacking critical armored reserves and high-quality infantry that were permanently committed to holding the line against the relentless Red Army. Kursk provided the necessary strategic breathing room for the West to build up the massive invasion force unmolested. Furthermore, the battle confirmed the immense confidence and morale boost for the Soviet Union. The successful defense and immediate counteroffensive, orchestrated by generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, proved the strategic maturity and superior command capabilities of the Red Army. The entire Soviet state, which had been pushed to the brink in 1941, was now fully mobilized, strategically competent, and irrevocably committed to the total destruction of the enemy. The immense victory at Kursk served as a powerful signal to the world and to the German people that the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, cementing the inevitability of the German defeat. The battle represented the final, crushing demonstration that the German war machine could not withstand the combined, coordinated power of Allied logistics, Soviet defense in depth, and sheer industrial mass.